building out everything too, by the way.
Welcome to the EndZone YouTube. Let's move the chains. We have a very, very special guest, Ryan Roberts. Ryan, go ahead and give your introduction real quickly. And y'all need to follow him if you're interested in analysis on the NFL draft or college football. And a lot of that is important because a lot of the guys that he analyzes directly relates to the United Football League. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, Ryan, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely, man. I really appreciate you for having me. Obviously, this is a super fun conversation because this is actually my first time being asked to talk about the UFL, even though it's something that I followed very closely this year, and obviously what the Stallions were able to do and what they've been able to do just in the alternative football spectrum the last couple years, especially. But so I'm excited to talk about a lot of the players from the UFL draft. Obviously, the merger was a big news, obviously before this prior season, and just kind of the continued rebirth, for lack of a better word, of alternative football and kind of moving forward. So Rise and Draft on Twitter. You can follow all my thoughts at A to Z Sports, where I talk about NFL draft, talk about college football. And you're absolutely correct. A lot of the players that were drafted, I had an evaluation on, just kind of looking down this list continuously. So I appreciate you for having me on, though. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Awesome. So we'll first talk about you've watched the UFL. What were your impressions on the level of play in the United Football League Season 1?
So I think when you're talking about alternative football leagues, the thing that can be a little bit unsettling is not the right word, but it could be a little bit hit or miss is just the quality of overall football, because what we had seen before that was USFL, XFL, and for a little bit there, it seemed like they were going to just be fighting against one another, right? Which, when you're talking about a major pool of talent, the more alternative leagues there are, more leagues just in general, the more that you are pulling away from the overall quality of talents, right? So I think that before the UFL, that was the fight that you were having, because ultimately the NFL was number one. It's going to be number one for the rest of time unless something drastically changes. So they're going to get the best football players, obviously. So now the next pool is CFL, and then UFL, and then obviously there's like the ELF overseas as well, which is a decent league that I have a couple buddies that are actually scouts in that league as well. So the less pools, though, I think the more quality the play is going to be, because I remember watching like the XFL, for the newer XFL, not the old XFL with Vince McMahon, where it was just like you're watching. I'm a football nerd. I'm a football junkie. I'm going to watch because football's on TV, but ultimately, like, just wasn't a great talent pool, man. Like, the quarterback play was bad. It wasn't super entertaining. I really enjoyed the UFL this year because I think with that merger between USFL and XFL together, I think that just made the quality of player and talent at a lot higher level this past year. So I thought it was super entertaining. I know the viewership was up comparative to what the previous, couple adaptions of alternative football had been. So I'm excited for continued birth, because I do think that this is a needed product ultimately. Like, I grew up with NFL Europe, and then the XFL tried to be a thing for a year, and then it really wasn't. And then we had the USFL, XFL. Now with the UFL together, and it seems like it has sustainability potentials into the future, I think it's a great thing for American football. I really do.
Just out of curiosity, were there any teams or players? I know obviously the Birmingham Stallions is one of them with Skip Holtz and got that Notre Dame connection, of course. But were there any teams or players that really caught your eye and kind of surprised you while watching this year?
Yeah, I did gravitate towards the Stallions, to be honest with you, because of one thing you just said, and that's Skip Holtz. Like, even dating back to, obviously Skip is Lou's son, but even back to when he was, a college football head coach and a college assistant, and he's just a really good football coach. So am I surprised that Skip Holtz has been pretty dang good in the UFL? Nope, not surprised about it at all. I would say like the biggest storyline obviously is Adrian Martinez was like a super volatile player in college, right? Nebraska, then over to Kansas State. It was just, he seemed to be getting his footing at Kansas State, and then he gets injured, and Will Howard takes over, and all those storylines ensue. But it was really cool to see, because I actually have like a little bit of a, not a personal connection, but one of the sports agencies that I work for actually is Adrian Martinez's agency that represent him. So it was just kind of really cool to see. They took a flyer on him late because of the injury and the inconsistent play, and he developed into the MVP of the UFL, which is a really cool thing, obviously, right? So the Stallions are definitely one that kind of I found myself watching each and every week because they were also just, I mean, we've seen what they've done the last couple years, right? Like they're a dominant football team right now.
Awesome, awesome. So we'll go ahead and get into the UFL draft that recently occurred. Now, for anybody who's watching, the UFL draft is a little bit complicated because it means that the players' rights have been drafted. So, I got very excited. I'm a Notre Dame fan. Sam Hartman got drafted to the Birmingham Stallions. It it looks like Sam Hartman has a good chance of making the team in Washington or maybe the practice squad. Even if he doesn't, he could choose to go to Canada. So just because a player has been drafted doesn't necessarily mean they're on the team. But and now that it's year two, there's a possibility that this is a more attractive league because it's less risky, that it might not fold, things like that. So, were there any guys in the draft that kind of caught your eye?
Well, and can I add to the UFL draft as far as like the
Yeah.
uniqueness of it is that also you have to feel it's like a strategic thing, right? Like you're not just evaluating a bunch of players and then drafting the best ones like the NFL does, right? The NFL, the first overall pick is who they deem to be the best overall player in a vacuum in that draft, at least at a position of need. For the UFL, they have to be strategic who they draft, right? Like you don't want to necessarily spend a first round pick on the rights to a player that most likely is going to make an NFL roster next year, and you are not going to have any opportunity to grab him. So as you can work down, actually, when you get into like what was it, like 8 rounds? I think was the 10 rounds. When you get down to the last round, the 10th round, you're talking about actually better football players the later they get drafted. But the reason that they're getting drafted later is because they're more likely to make a roster. That's why Sam Hartman was a little bit of a later pick because there is some expectation that he can make the Commanders roster in 2024. So it's super fascinating. But I will say that the thing that I think is imperative for alternative football is excitement, right? And I think that the first two quarterbacks that you saw get drafted this year, Memphis Showboats took Jason Bean, who is the quarterback that started at North Texas, then transferred to Kansas, was the backup to Jalen Daniels, but also ended up being a very important player because Jalen Daniels has been banged up. He's a dynamic athlete. I mean, if you look back to his high school kind of recruiting side of things, he was a legitimate track athlete as well. So I think that for the Showboats, like he's a guy that can come in and he brings instant excitement on the field because he might not be the most polished passer of all time. He might not be a guy that you're going to watch throw for a million yards, but similarly to what and Adrian Martinez did with his legs this past year, almost averaging 10 yards a carry. Like, I would not be shocked if you see something similar to what Jason Bean can do this year because he is a very gifted athlete, as is John Reese Plumlee, who was drafted by the Arlington Renegades. I mean, this kid was such a good of an athlete at Ole Miss and UCF that he was playing baseball and football at the same time. Like, this is a legit, I think he ran like 4.4 high at his pro day. Like, this is a very, very good athlete. So I think a couple of those kids have a chance to play if they do not get and they are pretty good shoe-ins to be alternatively quarterbacks, but you never know what can happen. But I think that those guys are bringing a lot of intrigue to the table. The one surprise first round pick, if I can just kind of rattle off a little bit, is that I actually thought that it was a little bit of an interesting one. So San Antonio drafted at number 7 overall pick in the first round, Gabe Hall out of Baylor. Man, I actually thought Gabe Hall has a chance to make an NFL roster. I'm not even sure what NFL roster he's on currently, but I mean, that kid is 6'6", 290 plus pounds, really gifted mover. He might be more of a practice squad level player early on, a guy that needs to just kind of let marinate a little bit and to continue to develop power and nuance to his game. But that's an NFL athlete on the defensive line. So it was very interesting to see him go quite as early as he did, but he's extremely gifted. And then the last guy I wanted to mention, because he's a guy that I do actually have a little bit of a personal relationship with, and I was happy to see him get drafted after going undrafted in the 2024 NFL draft. Last pick, Birmingham Stallions took Ethan Driscoll, offensive tackle for Marshall. Unfortunately, if there's any Notre Dame fans listening out there, Ethan was a part of the 2022 version that did beat Marcus Freeman a couple years ago, right? So I think that he, though, is a player that I would not be surprised if he ends up not making an NFL roster and he ends up in an alternative league like the UFL. I wouldn't be surprised if he has one good year of film, maybe 2 good years of film, whatever it ends up being, if he is on an NFL roster long term. This kid's 6'8 plus. He's a pretty good functional athlete. He's got strength to him. So they drafted him with the 80th overall selection, the last selection, the Mr. Irrelevant, for lack of a better term, in this draft, because I do think that there are going to be some questions of if he can make an NFL roster in 2024. I think it's possible, but if he ends up in the UFL, then the Birmingham Stallions got a really good one with the last selection in this draft.
Yeah, so I definitely want to start with Jason Bean. He was someone who was always exciting to me because I always watched Kansas. And I believe he played there like before Jalen Daniels came onto the scene, if I'm not mistaken. But I watched Kansas for Jalen Daniels for the most part, and then he was injured, and Bean would come in. I'd be like, oh, this is a really, really good backup quarterback to have, and someone who's extremely athletic. And my immediate reaction was Memphis Showboats, their offensive line. I mean, if you watched any Memphis Showboats games last year, their offensive line play was absolutely atrocious. And it pained me to say that because Jerron Jones was on that offensive line, and he was an all USFL guy, a Notre Dame guy too. And I had the opportunity when I worked for the USFL to talk to him, and he was all USFL. So he was very talented in USFL. And that just, it was a weird situation with Memphis, but he's someone who, has a definite impact immediately because of their offensive line struggles. Did you see how Drake Stoops got drafted too in the first, or I believe it was the second? What was it, first or second round?
I saw his name definitely pop on the screen because funny enough, I actually I work with someone. I also do some consulting with sports agencies for RPM data, and actually one of the players that Kelly Masters management. Kelly Masters was the one that had Gerald McCoy back in the day. She was the first woman agent to ever have a top 10 NFL draft pick. They actually represent Drake Stoops. So he's always been a guy that I've kind of kept close eyes on because, I mean, you never know, man. Like, honestly, like in this game, it is so interesting at times just to see how much situation matters, right? So if Drake Stoops ended up on a practice squad, even in 2024, like I would not be shocked if he's on an NFL just practice squad. I think that he's a guy that just needs to be in the right situation. But like he was a very vital player for Oklahoma last year. I mean, because they had Nick Anderson, who's a really good player that's coming back this year. They had Andrell Anthony, who's talented, that was at the University of Michigan before that, but he was banged up a lot of the year. They really did need a safety blankets. They had the tight end whose name's escaping, Austin Stogner, who was at South Carolina for 1 year, then came back to Oklahoma. They needed a middle of the field safety blanket, and that's what Drake Stoops ended up being for Oklahoma. So as a former walk-on, obviously the family ties are very easy to see there at the University of Oklahoma. But I mean, he's a kid that I think is definitely going to play professional football. Is it going to be the UFL? Is he going to be on a low-end NFL opportunity? I'm not really sure, but he's definitely a kid that's going to make a team in 2024, whether that is NFL or an alternative league.
Yeah, and I misspoke. The list I'm looking at is not the draft list. It's by team. So Drake Stoops, I believe, was drafted in the final round, but it's cool that he got drafted by the Renegades, of course, the team that Bob Stoops coaches. So that makes things interesting. And Bob Stoops, like right now, it's kind of up in the air whether a lot of these coaches are returning. That's a whole nother deal for a whole nother day. Were there any just, off the top of your head, any offensive linemen that you think could possibly make an impact? Because offensive line is always just I mean, I've been covering spring football since 2019 in the Alliance of American Football, and every single season there's a league. It's offensive line issues plague at least 4 of the 8 teams.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's the issue that I talked about in the beginning. I mentioned quarterback more than offensive line, but like those are the two positions that there's not even enough good offensive linemen in the NFL right now, right? So like when you're talking about like the second, third, fourth tier of offensive line talents around, I mean, you're scraping the barrel. I mean, I literally have a buddy that works for a team over in the ELF, the European Football League. That I mean, he's just desperate for offensive line play because you just can't find good ones. I mean, I mentioned Ethan Driscoll again, the offensive tackle out of Marshall that was the last selection. I think if he ends up on the Stallions, like I think he could be one of the best offensive linemen in the UFL. Like I just think that he has that much upside because I honestly thought that he would be drafted. Like I thought he was going to be a 6th to 7th round selection. He was not drafted, so I think he still has a chance to make an NFL roster. But certainly, I think that he would be excellent player in the UFL. I'm just kind of working up the list a little bit. I mean, Garrett Greenfield, DC Defenders with the 4th round out of South Dakota State. I mean, he's an easy one because he actually holds the offensive line record for the highest vertical leap at the combine in history. He had a 38-inch vertical this past year, which is just absurd to think about for a 300-plus pounder. Now, how translatable is that to offensive line play? I mean, it helps with short area explosiveness and like that type of stuff, but overall, it doesn't overly matter. But he's a talented athlete who I think still needs to get a little stronger. Needs to just kind of improve that power profile, but he's got solid enough length. He's got good length for the position. He's a really good athlete. So overall, I think he's a player that could definitely make it. And then the last guy that kind of popped on my vision was I was actually a pretty good fan of Donovan Jennings, who was the offensive tackle out of South Florida that was drafted in the 3rd round by San Antonio as well. He is a 6'5" or probably like 6'4" and some change. 315, 320 pounds, dense dude, physical. He played nothing but left tackle for the most part at South Florida. I think he could play inside as well. I, again, would not be shocked if he's on a practice squad in the NFL in 2024, but if he's another kid that somehow San Antonio does get to have him on the roster next season, I do think that he has a lot of talent, and he's a kid that can kind of move around the offensive line a ton.
Sorry, I was muted there. Okay, we'll shift over to our final question, the question that everybody wants to talk about, and it's quarterbacks, as you mentioned earlier. Are there some potential quarterbacks? And I know one quarterback in this draft is currently a free agent. I cannot pronounce his name, Shavon Cordero from San Jose State.
You got it, man. You were great.
Okay, there you go.
Confident. You had it. Yep.
I watched a couple of I'm a college football nerd, so like I'll watch, the random games, especially those late night games. So, he got drafted by the Battle Hawks. They have AJ McCarron right now, but and then Manny Wilkins and then Brandon Silvers behind him. But there's, kind of up in the air status for AJ McCarron. So I think he's one quarterback to look out for that could possibly have a good chance of playing in this league. Are there any maybe some practice squad fringe players who maybe could have or could have not been drafted into this draft that you think could maybe use a UFL season to get developed?
It's a great question. I would just kind of like to piggyback off the Cordero one for a second because he was a lot of fun. Not even at San Jose State. He was at University of Hawaii before that for the Rainbow Warriors, and he's just small, right? Which is why he probably didn't get more of an NFL chance than what he's getting right now, and why he is more of a UFL, type of guy right now. Is that I think he weighed in at like 5'10" and some change. Like he's just not a big guy. But if you watch San Jose State this past year or past couple years, I mean, he's exciting. He's got some good quickness to him. He's got a pretty snappy delivery. Like Cordero's a really interesting player. The one interesting one who honestly, like I had once thought that this guy was going to be a big time NFL prospect, and then injuries and inconsistent play just fizzled him was Keaton Slovis got drafted by the DC Defenders in the 2nd round with the number 12 overall selection. I mean, freshman year Keaton Slovis before the first shoulder injury kicked in. It was good, man. Really, really good. He had Michael Pittman Jr. back then. He had some Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like he was a really good player because people forget JT Daniels was supposed to be the dude for USC that year. He gets hurt, and then all of a sudden you're like, who's this 3-star from Scottsdale, Arizona that's coming into the game and throwing for 30-something touchdowns as a true freshman? It was Keaton Slovis. And unfortunately for him, shoulder injury, multiple. Then he went up to Pittsburgh. It wasn't good. He went down to BYU. It wasn't good. But then you see that there's still talent there. I mean, he went to the combine and ran like 4.56, I think, like some crazy number like that. He obviously has some intangibles and tangibles to work with. I mean, like his arm isn't the strongest, especially after a couple of the shoulder injuries, but like it's still standard for one of these leagues. Like I think he still has a more than good enough arm. I think he's accurate. It's just, can he handle pressure better? Right. And that's always been kind of the thing about Keaton Slovis is that he just kind of struggles a little bit to consistently handle and navigate pressure. I would say the other one, and it's funny because he spent some time in the state of Michigan, obviously, is Rocky Lombardi was a 5th round pick by the Michigan Panthers. Now, I'm not sure what the Michigan Panthers quarterback room looks like right now, but Rocky is another guy that's 6'3 plus, 220 something pounds, strong arm. He ran like, I think 4.68 to 4.7 flat at his pro day. So like, this is a pretty good athlete. Overall accuracy is sporadic, which again is why the NFL maybe wasn't super high on Rocky. But if you're just talking about pure arm strength and athleticism, he certainly has something to at least get excited for development's sake of kind of moving forward. And I mean, I would mention, like, I'm looking at like Tanner Mordecai, Sam Hartman. Like, I would mention Sam Hartman. I just, with a 9th round pick, with a number 72 overall pick, obviously there are, and we've talked about this already, there are some reasonable belief that potentially he might make an NFL roster when obviously he's on the Washington Commanders. I know he's fighting with like Marcus Mariota and I forget who the other quarterback on the rosters. I wrote an article about this that he's fighting with behind Jaden Daniels, but there is at least some opportunity to potentially make a team in 2024 in the NFL. But Sam Hartman would be a perfect UFL quarterback. He really would. I think that he would actually kind of thrive in this league. So if he's a guy that ever plays in UFL, whether it's next season or seasons beyond, I think Sam Hartman could be a really good alternative league quarterback. I still think that he has at least NFL potential to be a long-term backup, but you never know. Obviously, you literally were just talking about AJ McCarron being in the UFL just because he wants to play ball, right? Like he just wants to play ball. He could just go hold a clipboard in the NFL for a little bit, but he wants to play and let his kids watch him play. So those backstories obviously kind of parlay to where he is now. But I do think that a guy like a Sam Hartman would dominate the UFL or at least be a really good quarterback in the UFL if that opportunity to present itself.
Man, you mentioned Keaton Slovis. I remember watching him. I think I was like in high school when he went off. And
2019.
yeah,
2019, man. Yep.
senior year of high school. And I was like, this kid is gonna be the next, the next great quarterback. And then it
Yes.
just, then he went to BYU and I was like, okay, well, let's see what he does at BYU. Then Pittsburgh, and it just kind of like the wheels kind of fell off. So like if he could, find some stability, that would be awesome because I was a huge fan of him. I also think he just looks like Christian Bale a lot, and I
He
love
does.
love
That's funny.
Batman.
I've never painted those parallels, but he actually does look like Christian Bale a lot now that you mentioned it. Man, can I put it this way? I was so high on Keaton Slovis when he was a true freshman. Every single time, whether it was at USC the next couple years or whether it was at Pittsburgh, whether it was BYU, every time he had an impressive play, it pulled me back for a second, right? For a second, I was like, nope, he's coming back. It's coming back. Unfortunately, it never came back, but maybe it will in the UFL. Let's see.
It's funny you mentioned Michigan drafting Rocky Lombardi. Obviously, he's got the all-name team if the UFL gets him, but the Michigan Panthers they have what's considered like the deepest quarterback room. They had so many injuries. They had Brian Lewerke, Danny Etling, EJ Perry, and Bryce Perkins. And Bryce Perkins was really good. Unfortunately, he got an injury, and like if Bryce Perkins hadn't gotten injured, then like realistically, Michigan could have won the entire thing and could have possibly upset Birmingham. So it's funny you mentioned that.
I liked Bryce Perkins at Virginia. Obviously, he was a former Arizona State quarterback before that, but he was a very good player. I mean, he gave Notre Dame a lot to handle in the one game that they played of him. It was just Notre Dame was obviously just better than Virginia as a whole. But Bryce Perkins also spent some time. I'm a Los Angeles Rams fan, and he was the backup at one point to Matt Stafford. Was it Matt Stafford at that point, or was it still Jared Goff? It was probably early Matt Stafford a couple years ago. He was a backup, and he actually started a couple games when Stafford got hurt. So, I mean, another guy that, again, I talk about that dynamic elements, the running ability that he could bring to the table. That's super exciting in this type of league.
So just out of curiosity, were you a Rams fan, or I guess, yeah, you've always been a Rams fan. Do you remember John Wolford?
Oh yeah. Oh, Wake Forest, great job, Wolford, man. Yeah,
Oh,
no,
hey, yeah, there you go.
he was tremendous. I remember him at Wake Forest even more than just kind of his brief stint with the Rams because because Wolford was actually, if I remember correctly, and I think I'm recollecting correct on this, like he was like, the first couple years at Wake Forest, like he wasn't great, and then all of a sudden that final year, everything clicked, and he had a dynamic year. Obviously, under very stable coaching staff, obviously, that Wake Forest has now. Like, the talent isn't always great because of obvious reasons, but Wolford was a good one, man. Wolford, who was was the right before Sam Hartman era obviously had become. But yeah, Wolford was a really good player, and he was a backup obviously for a nice little cup of coffee for the Rams.
Yeah, so he played for the Arizona Hotshots under Rick Neuheisel, and they had a fantastic offense. And I had the opportunity. Scooby Wright and Niles Morgan had invited me out to a Hotshots game that year, and
Nice.
they were, no pun intended, or actually pun intended, they were getting hot right when the AAF folded. Like they were one of the better teams. And Scooby always says that they were the best ever spring football team. They were pretty loaded. They were really good, but that was
I,
that
I,
was
I, I honestly forgot about the Alliance Football League a little bit, right? Because it was like COVID obviously just killed it. Like it was just
oh
very,
yeah.
very unfortunate. But I like the Scooby Wright mention, man. Me and Scooby actually follow each other on Twitter. I've DM'd with him before.
Okay.
I know that you have a personal relationship with him. I tuned into one show where you were talking about just kind of your history with him visiting you and all that type of stuff. I mean, he was a dude for the University of Arizona. Like he was an
Oh yeah.
absolute stud. It was absurd to watch Scooby in college.
He's a great guy, and someone who's a proponent and wants to help spring football, which is
It's
just
great.
really awesome. Well, I think that wraps it up. 26 minutes. That's good timing. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I hope everybody out there watching enjoyed it. Great analysis on spring football.
Oh, appreciate it, man. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I hope to have come back on sometime, but this was absolutely a blast. Again, this is my first time. I hope I did everybody justice out there. I did the best I can with player analysis and everything, but the
Mhm.
UFL is definitely a growing league, and I was very happy to see the product that we had on the field this past year. Obviously, there's going to be turnover on that level of football, just with NFL having interest in some players. I mean, I just wrote an article about Kevin Austin just being signed obviously by the New Orleans Saints. So there's always going to be some natural turnover, but it is a great thing for the not only the NFL just kind of trickling down and being able to pull from that player, but as football fans, man, like we can't get enough of it, obviously, and having any type of spring football or just alternative league in general, it always adds to the fandom.
Yeah, I'll definitely invite you on during the season so we can get some of that in-depth analysis of the teams and the players who are really standing out. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment so we can move the chains.